Hundreds of thousands, many hundreds of thousands of physicians worldwide are working on this. Here are at the American Geophysical Union in San Francisco, just a sampling of a few more or less exhibitionist doctors who took the stage to proclaim that climate and human health are very important. It was, next slide, please. There were a lot of attendees. Next slide. But this is a summary of what I'd like to get across to you when we go through our Climate 101. And we have a lot to cover today, but I trained in New York, so I can talk really quickly. And basically, these are the 5 main points that I hope I can get across today. That the Earth, and let's stay on that same slide, the Earth is heating up, and yeah, it's anthropogenic, it's us. And number 3, we're sure. When we talk about a 97% scientific consensus, it's actually way more than that. It's more like 99%. It's bad. And I'm going to be very stark that climate disruption is quite simply the greatest public health threat that humankind has ever faced. And if left unabated, and those are important words, if left unabated, it is likely to cause the collapse of civilization and the extinction of much of the natural world, including us. And I think we can all agree that's not a very good day for public health. But if I thought there was nothing we could do, that's the 5th point. If I thought that we still did not have a chance to fix it, then I'd be eating my couple pounds of antique Oreo cookies that I've got stored up and binge watching The Real Housewives of Berkeley. But I'm here and there because we can fix it, and I'll show you ways that we can. I like this sign for one other reason. Only at a scientific conference would you have scientific citations on the placard. So next slide, please. So what Shakespeare called this most excellent canopy, the air, that's our atmosphere. And it's beautiful, and it's very thin, and it has just the right proportions of gases that allow life to continue and even to thrive. We can compare how thin that layer is if you were to take a basketball and put saran wrap over it and then scale that up. That's how thin. Next slide, please. So just this is real cliff notes on climate disruption. So the ring around the Earth, the dark part is the atmosphere, and the upper ring is the higher atmosphere, and that's where greenhouse gases, and they are called greenhouse gases. They mean heat trapping gases. That's represents them, and they're like blankets that hold in heat. And next, click. So the sun shines on the Earth and it passes right through those greenhouse gases. Next, click. To warm the Earth, and the Earth absorbs radiation and heat, which heats it. Next, click. Some of the energy is radiated back into the Earth in the form of infrared rays, and some of it goes right through those greenhouse gases. Click. And some of it is retained by the Earth to warm the Earth, and that is, without those greenhouse gases, we would be frozen over. So we actually need some greenhouse gases, but if the blankets get too thick, next slide, or next click, as they have done over the last many years, especially the last 70, then we have too warm a blanket, the world heats up. And how's that happening? Next slide, please. So basically, we've turned the atmosphere into an open sewer for greenhouse gases. And this is a slide that basically shows, well, it's a factory and it's emitting smoke, and mostly carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas that you all know about, but also water vapor, which also is a greenhouse gas. Next slide, please. Well, what are the greenhouse gases? The one we've heard most about, carbon dioxide, mainly from the burning of fossil fuels, but also from cement manufacturing and other industrial processes. You've probably heard that methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in the short term. And it comes from landfills, it comes from hydraulic fracturing for gas, it comes from livestock, especially industrial agriculture, low to the ground ozone, not the good kind of ozone that protects us from skin cancer, but the tropospheric or low ozone is also a greenhouse gas. There are assorted industrial gases, the most important of which nowadays are the hydrofluorocarbons, which we still use as refrigerants and are powerful greenhouse gases. There are aerosols such as black carbon or soot, and they too act as greenhouse trapping agents. Next slide. And the schema just shows you the important ways that, and the important sources I've just talked about in pictorial form, so that we know that that fossil fuel production, but also when we burn down forests, we're sending carbon dioxide up, and we're reducing the sink that vegetation can give us by absorbing carbon dioxide. I talked about cement manufacturing and industrial agriculture, the melting of permafrost. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. That too is releasing and can release lots of carbon dioxide and methane. Next slide, please. And this is just sort of a dramatic idea of when you cut down vegetation, especially rainforest, you are depriving us of our ability to draw down carbon. Next. And as I said, for now anyway, the predominant cause of global carbon emissions is the mining, combustion, and refining too of fossil fuels. Next slide. This is the famous Keeling curve, and basically it's based on direct data measured at Mauna Loa, and shows over a period, in this case 400,000 years, not really that long in geologic time, how much we have increased the carbon dioxide level, one of the greenhouse gases, in the atmosphere. And on the ordinate you'll see parts per million of carbon dioxide, and on the x-axis you'll see basically hundreds of thousands of years up till the very present. And you'll notice that there are periods of time when the CO2 level is higher, and there are periods when it's lower. Those low periods are ice ages. And human beings have only trod this planet for about 175,000 years. So we've seen at least one ice age where the parts per million of carbon dioxide went down to 180. But we survived. It got cold. Less blanket. It got cold. We survived. And we've survived up to temperatures of 280, a little bit higher. But if you look way at the end of the graph, you'll see that it's so compressed over the last, since we came out of the last ice age, that the exponential growth can't even be graphed here. That in the last, especially since after World War II, we're seeing extreme exponentiality, and we're also seeing warming that goes with that, as shown in the next slide. This is the Northern Hemisphere, but this is a similar, kind of a hockey stick here too, showing that the world has heated, and it's not just the Northern Hemisphere. We have heated the planet through the means I mentioned by about 1 degrees or 1.1 degrees Celsius since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so let's say 1850. And that's about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it makes a very big difference for a lot of reasons that I'm going to get into. And in the last 145 years, we've been able to measure it directly. And once again, you see exponentiality at the end of the slide in recent years. Next, please. So this is a little daunting that 19 out of the 20 hottest years have been since 2001. Click. And yep, the hottest have been the last 5. Click. And this is another graph showing global temperature, just departure from the mean, and it reinforces that between 1880 and 2019 that we have seen more deviations into high temperatures. And click. There's a 70% chance that 2020 will be the hottest year ever. Next slide. And where has all this heat been going? And if you click, you'll see that 93% of it has actually been going into the ocean, which, you know, has helped us in a way and has prevented extreme warming on landmass, but it also is not good. More than every other breath you take, more than 50% of the oxygen you get comes from the ocean, is derived from phytoplankton and other photosynthetic sources within the ocean. When you get rid of those, we'll have a great problem. The other factor is that carbonic acid, CO2, carbon dioxide is absorbed into the ocean as carbonic acid and kills a lot of zooplankton that have calcium carbonate shells. Also, famously, the beautiful corals are dying, and there are very complicated ecosystems that use them to survive, that survive via the corals, including millions, tens of millions of human beings. But the loss of oxygen and the loss of the basis of our food chain are extremely important. And next slide, please. And this is just an animation that shows you, and this is from NASA, that shows you from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we see the warmer colors and the darker, more heating. And look at after World War II, it really starts heating up very quickly. And when we go into the present last 30 years or so, we see dramatic increases as this slide visualizes. Next slide, please. Okay, so am I one single medical prophetess crying in the wilderness? Thank God, no. There are hundreds, many hundreds of thousands of doctors around the world who are doing this. And I strongly suggest that check out some of these links I'm leaving, and hopefully these links can be disseminated to you later. One example is the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. And it is a consortium, click, of 21 medical organizations. Some of those acronyms are going to be you, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, and many, many others who basically said this is something that is actionable, and healthcare workers can take a great role in reducing our risk in the future. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the things some of the major organizations have said. Click on the American Medical Association, which has since 2008 asked for doctors, other healthcare providers to take a major role in educating and promoting policies that help reduce the risk for the worst outcomes of climate disruption. In fact, they divested of fossil fuels very recently. Next. The American Nurses Association, and click, I want to quote this, that they acknowledge the challenges, or we acknowledge the challenges we face as a result of global climate change are unprecedented in human history. And then the American Public Health Association states something very, very similar. So yes, we are powerful voices and we can become more powerful. And as Harvey Milk famously said in Your Fair City, in regard to making the world a better place, I'm here to recruit you. Next slide. Once again, the Lancet, the esteemed Lancet Commission on climate change, saying exactly what we're saying. This is a medical emergency. And why? We're all experiencing it. People around the world, besides we're seeing drought, wildfires, especially true in California, also floods, tropical hurricanes, inland storms, etc., and rising sea level. Next. And just a graphic that illustrates that. And this is only from 1980 to 2019. The red areas show that there have been an increase in events, in worldwide extreme weather events. The red is droughts, fires, heat waves, and the blue tends to be floods and mudslides, and the ochre is just storms alone. So no, we're not imagining it. Next, thank you. And climate, yes, of course, it affects health. We all know that, and we're going to talk about how those things interlink next. Now, it's very difficult to say how many people die each year from climate change alone. from a pollution, it's actually generated by fossil fuels, it's much more. But the WHO attempted to estimate this in 2002, and they estimated about 150,000 people died per year from climate change. But then the next year, 2003, saw 70,000 people die in Europe just from a heat wave. So now their estimates are close to more like 250,000 a year. Next. So let's start with kind of extreme by extreme, starting with heat. Next. And let's talk about the individual and heat stress. And we as physicians and nurses and other healthcare providers are aware of this. Next. And you know, there's a typical kind of picture of who we suspect to be the most vulnerable. And it is true that the elderly, those who do not have a good, strong social structure, people to check on them, the people who have pre-existing conditions, including respiratory and cardiac diseases, people with mental health issues, especially those on neuroleptics, which reduces our ability to sweat, because it reduces the efficiency of sweat by and evaporating and cooling us off. But you know what? Healthy people, if outside long enough in temperatures that are high, especially if the humidity is high, they can die, and they do die also. Picture an elite runner, even a teenager who is very competitive and is running track and may not be taking the time they should to eat salt when appropriately and drink lots of water. They have and do die. Consider a 27-year-old agricultural worker. Let's put her in the San Joaquin Valley, and she has kids to feed. And she is paid by the weight or volume of what she ends up picking. And she is highly motivated so that even if water and areas of shade are available, she's highly motivated to keep picking, and she may die of a heat stroke, even though she is young, and even though she is otherwise healthy. Next slide. And of course, there's an issue of environmental justice. This slide focuses on just one aspect of it, that we see that low income, which for systemic reasons tends to also correlate with being people of color, that we see that communities of color, low-income communities, have a greater urban heat island effect, so that large asphalt areas tend to absorb lots of heat and affect local residents. Next slide, please. So we know there's a spectrum. You and I know this, and I do encourage you to go to some of the links I've been giving you, and you can actually, if you don't already have them, and you might, get handouts and posters and things to educate your patients. So that's one major role you can take in actually telling them what to do, how to recognize early heat problems, and how to take heat and how to act upon it quickly. And you can get such resources. But after an hour or so, without any response, we want them to seek help with us, because, next slide, as we go into heat exhaustion, and especially when people are socially isolated, it becomes very dicey to know when you're, because you're not necessarily thinking very clearly, when you're going into the next more extreme heat stroke, which is on the next slide, and which, as I said, does typically affect the elderly and people with other illnesses, but can affect the young. Next slide. So let's give some case examples. Chicago in 1995, 750 people died from heat-related illnesses, and many, many more were hospitalized. Next slide. And what I talked about earlier, in 2003, 70,000 people died during that summer, during that heat wave that lasted the whole summer. It was worse in August. And yes, it was the usual people we expect, but it was also the socially isolated. And in typically cool Europe, this was an unprecedented heat wave, so they really didn't know what to do with it. And they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have visiting nurses checking on people, things that, and that's the good news. The bad news is 70,000 people died. The good news is that although we still keep getting heat waves in Europe, far fewer die because of the activities of the public health and the medical community in remedying and helping to adapt to these problems. Next slide, please. So obviously we all know cardiovascular issues. That's one of the risk factors for dying in a heat wave, and vasodilatation puts a greater strain on the heart. And we should be educating, and we can be educating our patients about, in particular, talking to the cardiovascular patients about how take it really seriously. Don't try to work outside in hot weather. Next slide. And respiratory issues too. Ozone, close to the ground ozone, rises dramatically when the heat rises, especially when it goes above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's got a synergistic reaction with ozone and heat that causes severe inflammation, even at times permanent damage to the lungs, especially a lot of inflammation. Well, we know from prior flu epidemics that inflammation is not great and that people infected will have a far worse outcome. And we can extrapolate, and there's some preliminary data that in COVID-19 cases that they will have a worse outcome, infections will have a worse outcome with that kind of inflammation to the lungs and airways. Next slide, please. So we talked about some adaptation strategies that we can work with. Our local governments, we can, and city councils and the Bay Area Air Quality Management District and other air boards to be advocates, as well as to be advocates in any other way we can, including through the medical organizations that I'm going to want you to look into. So making surfaces lighter when we can, having more cooling centers, etc. Next slide, please. So we'll talk about drought, and not just how it affects food supply, but drought. And next slide. And I spent my deformative years in the San Joaquin Valley. And this is, well, nothing more need be said. Next slide. Water scarcity is already a problem. By definition, drought is a worsening of water scarcity. Over 40% of the world's population. Click again. And we see that aquifers are drying up over the world. And the darker the warm color, the more millimeters per year they're drying up. And it adds up over time. We're now seeing, if you look at the California area, you see that the Colorado River Basin in the west, that supplies water to 40 million people, and it's losing several millimeters per year of water. Next, please. And of course, when there's less water, it's harder to grow crops. In addition, when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you get a lower protein content per crop yield and lesser amounts of minerals that are important to health. Next slide. And then, as we all know, and this slide is pretty self-evident, that hotter years typically have more fires, and we can all relate to that very closely right now. Next slide. And this is something that's been going on now really for longer than a month, much longer. The fire season in the West has increased by 135 days in the last, since 1980, I believe. Next slide. Which is just emphasizing once again. And let's go to the next slide. And it's not just here. You probably all remember that in the winter, our winter, which is the summer in Oceania, in Australia, New Zealand, that they had also, we are in an unprecedented period of fires. I mean, the fires that are burning across the west coast of our country, that the number and the severity, that is unprecedented. Make no mistake. And so was it in New South Wales and other parts of Australia in their summer. And this slide is to remind me that they lost 500 million animals And so, next slide, we have to keep in mind, because it is important to us, that our world is shared by non-human denizens also, whom we love. Next slide. So another way that climate change is affecting human health is through infectious disease and the vectors that carry such diseases. So next slide. As the world, as the planet heats up, then tropical diseases are on the move. They're moving to more northerly climes, and their vectors are moving to more northerly climes. So I'm going to pick on Aedes aegypti, who became very famous when Zika started spreading. But she also spreads dengue fever, West Nile virus, and chikungunya. So a lot of different diseases. Next slide, please. And as we look at the range of Aedes aegypti, you see that we have it. Yes, we do have it in the United States, and it's probably increasing its range. Next slide. And not to keep beating on this one poor mosquito, but as I've said, the range increases, but there are lots of ways that mosquitoes, and not just in reference to Zika, but other diseases, are worse when climate change, when the planet is heating. Next click. They get a little bit hyperactive and hot to trot. Next. And they get, and so they reproduce, they party more, they reproduce. And as the world heats up, they bite more. And next slide. The virus itself incubates more quickly to a mature replicative phase so that we can be infected per mosquito more readily. Click again. So we need to generalize that. So there's increasing time of transmission, but let's generalize that. Next slide shows that malaria is also, though it's not this is a protozoan rather than a virus, but its range is also increasing. It's going from regions that were low-lying and warm to regions that are cooler. And remember, this is a disease that affects 500 million people every year and kills 1 million. So these vector-borne diseases are very important. There are more, including Lyme disease, especially on the East Coast, with carried by ticks. But it's very important throughout the United States. Next slide. Now, the question that one might ask is, does this epidemic, does COVID-19, does the SARS-CoV-2 virus, does it have any relationship? It's a zoonosis, so caused by a mutation from one animal. It makes a mutation that it can now use humans as its replicative machinery, and even in this case, sicken humans. And yeah, the answer is yeah. We, animals and humans, are just living too close together. We're commingling way too much. Part of that is because it is that animals are losing their habitat due to expansion of human populations, but also due to the fact that we are either clear cutting or burning a lot of forests where they normally would live. So, and we're moving outward into their habitats. So our households are commingling way too much. So we have examples in the past. HIV, probably from old world primates, made that mutational leap from an animal to humans. Ebola from bats, SARS-1 probably from bats to civets, H5N1, birds, so-called swine flu origin, birds and pigs, and SARS-CoV-2, definitely bats, possibly bats to pangolins to humans. So yes, it plays a role. Next slide. So we talk about floods, and floods are increasing in frequency. Next slide. And in severity. We know the hydrologic cycle. Well, what happens is that the evaporation off the earth goes into the atmosphere, and as I said, now there's more water that can be held and come down as precipitation. But when there's more water in the air, when it rains, it really pours. So you get amazing floods, as well as increasing amounts of water that's dropped from storm surges, well, from tropical hurricanes. Next slide. And this is simply to repeat what I said. Warmer air holds a lot more water vapor, 7% per degree Celsius, and we're already just a bit above 1 degree Celsius. Click. And then click again. And we'll go from here to the next slide. So this is an example, the city of Houston from Hurricane Harvey in 2018. No city has ever seen that much water drop in a single day. And part of that is because so much water is held in the air. Next slide. There are rain bombs that occur over places. You don't picture Tucson, Arizona as having rain bouncing off a huge storm cloud. Literally, you can see the rain bouncing off the ground in this video, but that's what's happening. Giant rain bombs are occurring inland also. Next slide. And this happened in the Oroville Dam. To the Oroville Dam, 200,000 people had to be evacuated. It almost broke. Fortunately, it did not. 6 months later, there were fires in that region. So it's important to understand that floods don't cure drought, and they don't prevent fires later. Next slide. And that same year, this was 2017, this was one way through San Jose. Next slide. And there are health impacts that are many, including physical injuries, all the way from drowning to being hit by things that are floating in the water, mental health issues, mold, and on and on. Next slide. And then there are waterborne diseases. Things we were concerned about anyway become increasingly severe. Next slide. So this guy in Nebraska in 2015 is kind of enjoying himself, and probably a hot day, but he doesn't know what's probably on the next slide. Probably doesn't know what's on the next slide. And that's that waterborne illnesses increase right after, they can be temporarily related to flooding events. Next slide. And I just like this slide. Somebody actually built, according to, you know, what the Bible says, a replica of Noah's Ark. And I guarantee no animals were saved in the creation of this ark, but he wanted it for people to come look at. And what ended up happening is there was an unprecedented, so let's click again. There was an unprecedented storm in his area, and he had to insure for flood damage to his ark. For $1 million, he had to sue his insurance company for $1 million. Obviously, he didn't have the same kind of insider information that Noah had. Next slide, please. And the biggest killer of all, related to the burning of fossil fuels, is air pollution. Next slide. This was actually not the campfire. This was another fire. A view across the bay. Next slide. And this is just from the clearer view you see is a nice Sunday when there isn't a lot of vehicular traffic on the road. And it wasn't during a fire season, that I took from a little perch I have here in Berkeley looking at your fair city. And then the slide that's cloudy where I can't even see all of Berkeley, let alone the Bay Bridge, that was taken 2 weeks ago. Next slide. And once again, I don't want to belabor, you saw the orange skies. Next slide. So the estimates worldwide range between 7 to 9 million people die from air pollution. Now, especially when I'm talking about that 9 million estimate, but it's 7 to 9 million. Most of them die from ambient air pollution, from outdoor air pollution, mostly caused by the burning of fossil fuels. But a lot of them die from having sick buildings, and even from things like, so 4.2 million roughly worldwide. The minority, but still a sizable amount, die from indoor air pollution. And a lot of that is really, in fact, the majority of that is due to wood stove cooking, doing it for cooking food, for warming a dwelling, and even sometimes just for the light from the flame. These are major killers, and air pollution obviously is the main concern. Next slide, a major concern. And let's talk about air pollution. So in this country, we have one major MIT study and many others that show that we suffer 200,000 excess deaths in America alone every year, premature deaths. And the American Heart Association estimates that 180,000 non-fatal heart attacks occur every year in this country due to fossil fuel pollution. 150,000 hospitalizations and 130,000 ER visits for asthma, according to the EPA. And it's actually 11 to 13 million missed school days. This is pre-pandemic. Next slide. Air pollution affects the mental health and cognitive ability of young people, and that's very worrisome. I mean, when you consider these PM 2.5, these particles, and that's the main thing that's of concern, that they can contain, they're not just like inert pieces of carbon. They can contain very toxic, volatile hydrocarbons, polyaromatic hydrocarbons. They can also contain things like lead. So we can permanently damage and temporarily and permanently damage cognitive ability of young people. Next slide. So air pollutants and allergens, we've really already talked about ground level ozone and its inflammatory effects on the respiratory system, including the upper airways. Next slide. And let's talk about PM 2.5. The smaller the particle, the more dangerous. Just put simply, the fine particulates cause or exacerbate heart disease. They cause or exacerbate lung disease, including causing asthma. They cause lung cancer and probably other cancers. They are cause of behavioral abnormalities. They can cause adverse reproductive effects. They can cause dementia. There's a growing body of evidence that that can happen. Next slide. They also can cause, believe it or not, the new cases of diabetes, type 2 diabetes mellitus, 150,000 new cases per year in this country. Next slide. And this is an experiment that got accidentally done. So Carmageddon refers to, and many of you have heard of it, in Los Angeles, one of their freeways got closed down very, not very long, for, I don't know, a handful of weeks. And during that period of time, this 10-mile stretch was studied very carefully by intrepid investigators who started measuring the ultrafines and fine particulates and found that that even after a few days of the cars being off the road, we get this co-benefit of having less low to the ground, less climate pollutants low to the ground, and the massive decrease in the amount of these harmful particles and fewer visits to local medical centers. Next slide. Just to remind everybody that fracking, which occurs in a large amount of fracking occurs in this state and throughout the country. In this state is predominantly for oil. It causes not just air pollution, but also water pollution. Next slide. And if you think your allergies are getting worse, no, you're not imagining it. We know that in 2000, we saw an increase, this is across the nation, of grains of pollen per cubic meter, and it's estimated by 2040 that it's going to get a lot worse and is getting worse year by year. Next slide. Now, let's talk a little bit about the positive feedbacks or self-reinforcing feedback loops. I talked about one of them, that water vapor that is released in the burning of fossil fuels also is a greenhouse gas. Here's another major problem. What we don't want, one of the reasons why this is an incredible emergency, besides all the fires that are burning and floods that are happening, is that the permafrost, so the areas of the peatlands in the Arctic and the boreal forest regions, they have more carbon dioxide and more methane. They have more carbon than all of the rainforests in the world. They always are releasing some. they are now releasing more. If we keep heating the planet and they suddenly really take off, that would be the kind of positive feedback that in the worst case scenario could be unstoppable, even if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow. That is why, one of the reasons why this is an emergency now. Next slide. But this is actually a clear day, but it's a rainy day in the afternoon, looking once again at your fair city. And it represents to me some light breaking through some dark clouds, because I've given you quite a few dark clouds today. But let's talk about where there's hope, because there is. Next slide. It doesn't show this slide very well, but it's making the point that the so-called renewable energies, wind and solar, and to some extent tidal power, can supply us with enough electricity. People like, and he's not the only one, but Mark Z. Jacobson and his engineering team at Stanford have long studied and modeled how the world can get to zero carbon emissions by 2050, or nearly zero carbon emissions by 2050. Next slide. We can do it, I mean, and globally it is happening. It could be happening faster, especially if this country did more, but it's happening. So if you look at, for wind alone, this is a global projection. In 2000, they thought, well, by 2010, we'll have 30 gigawatts. But click, and you'll see that in reality, by 2019, that was exceeded 22 times. Next slide. Let's talk about the sun's energy. Every hour, enough to supply us with energy for a full year. Well, we don't need to put up that many solar panels, and we don't need all the sun's energy a full year every hour. But it just illustrates the point that this is actually cheap energy. Next slide. And once again, when you look at projections, they usually underestimate. So globally, again, 2002 projection that by 2010, we get 1 gigawatt per year. But in reality, we exceeded that by 17 times. And by 2019, we exceeded it by 121 times. This is globally. Next slide. And when people say, yeah, but you can't store it, that's not true. Even in the United States, you can see that the storage capacity in photovoltaic cells has gone up dramatically. And it's going up even more in other parts of the world. And you can see that the cost of silicone, the crystalline silicone and other solar cell modules, that it's going down dramatically. Next slide. And a lot of countries are able to do what's called leapfrogging. So this is actually in South Sudan. And this is a household that used to have to rely on that very polluting indoor wood smoke in order to cook food and to keep warm. But once they were able to purchase for far less than it was ending up costing to get the wood, to purchase by pay-as-you-go policy solar panels, they put that on their dwelling, and it was able to provide them with the kind of electricity they needed. So this is becoming actually really very cost effective in the so-called underdeveloped or overexploited, whichever you want to think of it, in the underdeveloped countries, or developing countries is a better way to look at it. We are seeing more electric vehicles, and especially from, you know, the tropospheric, the close to the ground pollution, carbon pollution, and other types of pollution. They help quite a bit. They also can be, you can also get sources by community choice, which you have in San Francisco, as we have in the East Bay. We can choose, pay a few extra bucks a month, and we can get PG&E to give us, we're still using their grid, but to give us more power from renewable sources. Next slide. Other things that offer hope, and we have neither the time, but we'll just keep clicking along on this slide, showing that there are lots of ways that permaculture, or also better known as regenerative agriculture, can help to draw down carbon and keep healthy topsoil. Something, for instance, fires and floods are very damaging of topsoil. The use of biochar, the use of other soil additives can both increase crop yields and can prevent a lot of the damage we see done by climate change by drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Next slide. So, I mean, I'm going to skip over this, but basically, before I do, you can estimate your carbon footprint, and sometimes patients like to do that, so you can give them an app to do that. That can be fun. Next slide. And, you know, it's good for all of us to consider how important air travel is, that, you know, 1 to 2 tons of carbon dioxide is round trip across this country, and a typical California per capita household electricity is 3 tons of carbon dioxide a year. So that's a big expenditure. But see, we're doing the right thing. We're having a virtual meeting. Next slide. Diet is extremely important. And here, once again, I'm going to use the word co-benefit. The less red meat, and there are many ways, many sources of this information, and many investigators who have shown it, that a diet that has more red meat is less healthy. And even in terms of all-cause mortality, colon cancer, and probably also other causes such as cardiovascular disease. So if you look at the ordinate, you see there's that other benefit, the climate benefit. So how much, what is the carbon footprint per diet, per calorie? And you'll see that the diet that's higher in meat releases more greenhouse gases from many aspects of it. And as you come down in the amount of dairy, of red meat, and then even dairy and egg, and you get closer to a vegetarian diet, you end up eliminating red meat, which is good for you and also good for the planet. Next slide. This is just a quick reminder that there is a relative risk or an odds ratio when you eat 1 serving per each serving of total red meat of 1.17 of all-cause mortality. So yes, there's definitely a co-benefit of eating less red meat. Next slide. So what am I asking you? What am I trying to recruit you to do? Is to join one of these organizations, both to educate yourself, to help educate your patients, so that all of us together can get on board. Climate Health Now is a group. This is a picture of medical students, obviously before the pandemic, with a few of the attendings, educating, forming coalitions to work both not partisan, but politically, working with decision makers, giving education, including educating medical students about climate disruption and how to educate their patients about it. Next slide. There are many other groups, Physicians for Social Responsibility, San Francisco, you can look into that. And remember, they have materials that you can use for yourself. They have videos that you can use, and they have materials for your patients. Next slide. And 350 Bay Area is another such group. All of these aim at drastic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and bringing carbon and drawing down carbon whenever possible by whatever natural means if possible, with an eye to environmental justice and also an eye to a just transition for workers. So, one other thing is healthcare without harm. It's been going on for a couple of decades. You've probably heard about it, but it's been very successful in getting rid of, or at least diminishing, the amount of toxins released from our healthcare facilities, which used to be a big source, including greenhouse gases. And it's something you may want to look into. I'm sure your institution already has. So, in conclusion, we love this beautiful planet, the colors. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine anything more beautiful. But as people who work for health and for life, we kind of can. That is, when you think about, as I said before, a planet that is graced by life, that's what we're really standing up for. And in a sense, our patients and us, we're all now doctors of human destiny. And we can work, we must we can heal ourselves. So I thank you very, very much for this opportunity.